This last couple weeks, we finished up our series on Catholicism, and it was a pretty fun, interesting series. Lots of different aspects and things to compare between them, and Protestantism in general. But now we're on to a new thing. I don't know if we're going to be sticking up with this theme of more archaeological-driven evidence for Christianity, or if we're going to do something new after this when Zach is back, but this is what I decided to go over. So I'll start us up with some prayer and we'll go from there. Dear Father, thank you for this day and everything you've provided for us. Thank you for Jesus Christ, just the provision for sins and salvation, how you knew from the very beginning that we were going to need a Savior, and how you provided for us in Him. Thank you how we can always trust in you and who you say that we are, for how we can live our lives. That how we live our lives is through trusting you and believing who you say we are, and not just relying on our own strength. We love you so much, and in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so first I'm going to go over just a couple little basic things, prefixing before we get into the main part, which is actually a video from a dude who he runs a YouTube channel called Expedition Bible, and oh man, I got one of his books. It's really great. It's like basically a picture book that goes over. It's called Where God Came Down. And it goes over in 10 chapters, I think, 10 different places where we know God was, or where Jesus was, relating to the Old Testament or to the New Testament. And yeah, he has a pretty great video on Jesus' tomb. But first, we're going to talk about truth, right? What is the value of truth? And so we as Christians believe that God is the source of all truth. And as a result of that, just simply by searching for truth, we can come to a greater understanding of knowing Him. And in fact, this is the thing for many people, even atheists, teaching them to search after truth is going to lead them to God, searching after that most highly of all. But at the same time, we need to be aware that how we search matters a lot, right? We need to be intentional and honest about how we search after truth. And in addition, then, what we do when we find truth matters a lot, right? I can say, oh yeah, I know about that thing, but if I don't do anything about it, if I'm not going to change my life as a result of it, then why did it even matter? The search was pointless. So today we're going to go over the evidence for Jesus' tomb, and yeah, we're going to learn a little bit about the truth of Jesus' actual life here and His resurrection. And then the purpose of archaeology. So archaeology as a field of study, it's literally the study of ancient things, but particularly ancient peoples and civilizations, so how they interacted, the sort of things that they did thousands of years ago. And in some ways, it's kind of like crime scene investigation, but there are no witnesses, and the sort of evidence you're working with is not, let's put it one way, it's not the same as if you're trying to get DNA off of a rock or something. You just can't do that. This stuff that's thousands of years old. So really, it's more historical. It's about, can we learn what was going on back in the past? But here's the key is, well, there's a bit of a caveat to archaeology, is it only tells us part of the story. It only tells us what was there maybe at a particular time in the past. It doesn't necessarily tell us why it was there or what was actually happening. And so this is where, as far as archaeology is concerned, we combine it with historical records, documentation that people have written over thousands of years. And you can use archaeology to not only verify the validity of those historical records, but then once we've done that, we can use those historical records as reasoning for why things were happening. And so with the Bible in particular, this is very important, because you're going to find plenty of empty tombs, but finding a particular empty tomb in a particular location that is described by historical record that could have only known that if they were there, and why that tomb is empty is very important. It gives you a much more complete picture of the real history and the real truth behind it, as opposed to what was before, or what just by looking at some rocks. So, now we're going to get onto the video real quick here. So that is Jesus' tomb. Are there any questions? There's a couple things that I wanted to note. So the full, that's okay, right? Yeah. The full story behind that is, like, once again, Jesus died, was buried in this tomb, he rose from the dead, and then Christians started coming to his tomb as a place of worship. Of course, the destruction of Jerusalem that was done by the Romans as a result of Jewish rebellion, I guess, that's how it went. Christians left. They all kind of saw the signs. It's actually kind of a funny thing in recorded history. There's not a mention of a Christian dying in that cataclysmic event, because they saw the signs. They knew bad things were happening, and they left, but they came back shortly after. And then that's part of why, as part of his persecution, Hadrian decides to build his temple there as part of Aelia Capitolina. And in fact, that was the main temple, but there was also a portion that was built on the Temple Mount itself, on Mount Moriah. And so then after that stays around until Constantine comes by. So the Roman Empire suffers this, split in politics and war constantly happening. Constantine comes along, reunites the Roman Empire under Christianity, destroys the pagan temple that was there on the spot of Jesus' tomb, and then builds a new one, this mausoleum. And we know from archaeology how everything lines up. There's actually one thing that I was showing Joanna yesterday that's like really cool, because it shows you exactly how things lined up, and it covered not only where Jesus was crucified at Golgotha, but also where his tomb was. Then in the period between then and when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre gets built, you have Muslim invasions. So around, it's like 600, more like 690 something AD, you have an invasion that destroys some stuff, and then I believe it's like 1000 AD, 1100 AD, you have another invasion that comes through and just completely destroys everything, including destroying the tomb itself. So we don't have the tomb anymore, because those were destroyed. In fact, in his book, he mentions how often pilgrims would come and chip off a little bit of the tomb to take home with them. So that's kind of interesting. And so because of that, we don't have the tomb anymore, which is why there's that edicule that's built in to kind of sort of spiritually represent the tomb. And then after the Crusaders come on, liberate Jerusalem, and then build the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in after 1200 AD. And then from there, it really has stood. Of course, there's been restorations continually, but from there, it's stood. So we know the full history of from now until Jesus' time of his tomb. And so this kind of leads me to an idea, which is, well, what is the most important fact in Christianity? And if fact is a truth that's tied to reality, what is the thing that we can go and find in reality that is the greatest evidence of Christianity? The thing upon which all other things rely upon. some of that gets into the philosophical ideas of like, well, how do we determine how important a particular truth is or whatever? And in this case, I'm really going on, well, what is foundational? In this case, what gives us a reason to believe, or maybe more precisely, what of Christianity has so significantly changed how we believe based on its tie to reality. And I would argue that that is Jesus' resurrection. It is, without that, there is nothing else. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:14, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. AKA, there's no purpose to this. There's no life that would be given. It's not going to be good simply because moral standards or whatever. Instead, it's good because Jesus was raised from the dead, because we know it's true. If it's not true, then there's really no purpose to it all. And so then, well, how do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? And there's lots of different reasons that we have for these. Archaeology is just one of them. But, from among the first, well, we have eyewitness testimony, right? We have the Gospels, we have Paul's epistles, James, Peter, etc. They all testify to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And we have Christian sociology and history. All evidence from early Christians indicates that they believe that Jesus rose from the dead. None of their actions make sense unless they do believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And many early Christians were people who became Christians only because they believed that Jesus had rose from the dead. Paul being one of the greatest examples, but also James is a good example. Thomas is another good example of these people. And early Christians were willing to die for their beliefs. That shows a very, very strong conviction. And the proximity to which Jesus' resurrection happened and people like Stephen willing to die for their beliefs is so close that you really don't believe that Stephen could have been confused about what was going on at the time. Once again, the recency of these claims to the event, Paul's epistles are often taken as the earliest documents dated to be the earliest written documents in the New Testament before even the destruction of Jerusalem, which would date them to before 70 AD. And if we're going to say, well, let's pick the latest date possible and say it's 70 AD, that's only 40 years from when Jesus was crucified. That is well within the lifetime of many, many people. And in fact, it's likely that it was even sooner than that, even as early as 50 AD. And so at that point, it's 10, 15 years since Jesus' death. There are many, many people who are going to be alive who are going to be able to refute these claims, and yet that is not what we see happening. And this leads into the idea that, well, one of the reasons why we can have confidence is because it was very possible for people to refute these claims. These are not claims that you can say, there's no way to disprove it. No, there is a very clear way of disproving the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. They would just need to produce his body. His body isn't going to just disappear somehow, unless you are a Jew, I guess, then maybe it does. But the point is, it would have been very easy to show, no, Jesus is still dead, here's his body, there you go, end of the case. But that's not what they were able to do, and there we go. So, and then finally we have archaeological evidence which just solidifies the validity of the historical records that we have. We have this testimony from the epistles, from the Gospels, but this archaeological evidence increases our confidence in the validity and the truthfulness that these eyewitnesses are telling. So, yeah, there we go. Is there anything else?
With like the where the church of the Holy Sepulchre is and stuff, like how widely accepted is it by other archaeologists, like that this was
is the location of Jesus' tomb?
Yeah.
I would say most. if not pretty much everyone agrees with that.
That it's just some sort of significant place.
Yeah. So where you get disagreement is on what actually happened, right?
Yeah.
Many people don't believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead, but pretty much anyone who is a real archaeological historian will agree with, yes, this is the place that Christians from the very beginning believed this was Jesus' tomb. This is where it was located. And you have similar sorts of things with like the Temple Mount. Some people claim, the Temple Mount wasn't actually where the Dome of the Rock is. It's like, no, we have history. We know what was built before this and before this and before this. And even though we haven't been able to do an archaeological dig on that spot, just all the history and even descriptions from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, of where things lined up relative to each other, we know that is where the temple was. But ironically, like to me, it's not the most important part for Christians, even though it's very close. They're very close to each other. You can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the Temple Mount. These places were not very far away. And in fact, Golgotha was by, I believe, maybe Jerome's record, literally a stone's throw away from his tomb. So these places were very close. And there were some things when he was saying stuff, he was saying like 81st century. That was confusing me because I heard 81st century. But he was talking about the first century of AD, where these tombs were built. And so those kolkim were a particular feature of Jewish cemeteries at the time, Jewish tombs at the time, that was only really in use from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. So it's a very, very specific particular time period that we're looking for, which is pretty unique among archaeological finds. And so we have many authentic Jewish tombs that date to the time of Jesus that have a stone that was rolled in front of them, that very much like how you would see in a children's book. These...
Was it literally like...
Literally, yes. Yes, literally round stone, like that's exactly how it was. While we don't have Jesus' exact tomb, we have several tombs that match how it was described in the Bible from that area, like within a mile or two. So, yeah. Anyway. Very great.
Do you have his book?
I do have his book, yeah. So it's on Amazon. It's less than $30.
That's how I've seen.
It's like a
little thin for.
So it is a little thin. He has lots and lots of photos and pictures, and it's very similar to the content that he has in a video. Okay. And then he has a bunch of notes. So he goes in more detail. He includes references like quotations and more detail and stuff. So you will learn more by having this book. And he has each chapter focuses on something different. The chapter that he has on this is called the Garden. So he has 5 chapters for the New Testament and 5 chapters for the Old Testament. So he actually goes like Jacob's Well, for example, is one where we can feel very confident we know where Jacob's Well is in real life, and it's still a well to this day. It's pretty incredible. Like when you start looking at all of these things and you start adding it up, it's just it's incredible. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for coming.